Okay, we're getting ready to start our live event, but we're giving some folks a few minutes before so they can sign on. But it is great to be here with you. Today's title, we're going to be talking about the Supreme Court, COVID-19 still, and the religious liberty challenges that are out there today. And before we get started, I just want to say thanks again. Thanks for tuning in. I mean, this has been kind of a learning experience for me. I mean, constantly reading about all these different things, these policy actions that are happening to try to bring good information to you, but also trying to give you a sense of how we as Christians, we're supposed to engage all these issues for the sake of our culture, but also for the sake of the mission of our church. And these questions, there's a lot of things that have to be answered so that we can do that faithfully and joyfully and effectively. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for sharing comments this session. Thanks for sending in your questions. But the biggest thing for me is thanks for sharing. What happens is after we record this thing, a lot of you are sharing this, and that has been really great for us. As I said to you before, we're trying to build this following and build this voice from the ground up. We can't do this without you. And so if you do like what you hear on this, please join our Word from the Center email list. You can text LCRL to 444-999. Yeah, go ahead and do that because, we'd like to get that list up to 50,000, 100,000, 500,000 eventually so that we're in this kind of together and bringing one voice in our advocacy in D.C. In support of our churches, our schools, and universities. So again, we can't do this without you. Thanks so much. Today, Supreme Court, COVID-19, religious liberty challenges. There's growing concerns over government overreach as we start to try to open our country back up. And the real issues are who gets to make these decisions. And you're starting to see that. There are government officials who think, I get to make those decisions. Well, yes and no. And the people have a voice in these things. I mean, their own livelihoods are at stake in these things too. But especially we've been talking about the church's role in all of this. And I've said to this over and over again, the church is essential. If your state is defining the church as non-essential, you've got a problem. That's a First Amendment problem. And that's something that the churches need to speak with a clear voice saying, you've got to change this and this has to be honored. And right now we're going to talk about some of the cases that are out there. Alliance Defending Freedom and the Becket Fund, I've been working with them for a long time on the Hill. They're doing a phenomenal job, but they also need us to kind of share our stories with them for the sake of their litigation. So again, if you see some of these things happening and you can let me know about this, I can share some of those stories with them because they're fighting for your First Amendment right to be the church in the middle of all this. I love this quote. It was a California pastor because California's pushing back on again, California's taking a turn now and shutting things down again in a lot of ways. And one of the pastors said this, he said, we're not Major League Baseball. We are not the NBA. I think his name was Pastor Carroll. He said, we're not a gathering of strangers. As pastors, we bury these people. We bleed with these people. We minister to these people. We are a family, not a group of strangers. And I think that's an amazing thing. It's an amazing statement. Pastor's wife I guess we had a problem with the phone going up and down. It didn't actually orient itself properly. So sorry about that start from the side. Now we're flipping back up. But again, when we're talking about that pastor, I love what he said. We are not a group of strangers. We are a family of believers. And so again, we're essential to what's going on out there. And then we're going to talk about Supreme Court cases that have lasting effects on can you be a Bible-believing Christian in the culture that we find ourselves today. And that's the real concern. Now, it's amazing. I saw this picture this week. It was of New York City. Now, we served in New York City back in the 90s, and I'm going to tell you something. New York was always full of life, and there was all kinds of problems going on all the time in the city, but there was all kinds of things, all kinds of energy in the city. This is a picture during the pandemic. It is empty. That's amazing to me. But there are people who actually think that this is something that's good, that it needs to continue this way. I watched a documentary this week by Michael Moore, and I'm not a big Michael Moore fan, but I watched this one because I wanted to hear what he was saying about this, and it was on the green movement, and it's called Planet of the Humans. But what was amazing to me, so he calls the green movement a scam, alert if you want to watch it, but let him have his say. But at the very end, I wanted to know, what's the solution? And the solution is less people. That's their solution. And I thought, wow. I mean, they look at certain people as, well, we can get rid of that. Well, constitutionally, thank God we live in a country which says every individual has dignity, every individual has inherent rights, and we have to find solutions as we serve and care for one another. So there's a battle out there, and it's not always about the facts. That's kind of the cover. We only go by the facts. Everyone has the same set of facts, the purpose of the facts, and the direction of the facts. That's what's in question. And so, is this pandemic a challenge to return to the family? Is this pandemic a challenge to return to the church? Others see it as a nail in the coffin of the family and the church. Is this pandemic a return to self-reliance? And when I say self-reliance, I'm not talking about individualism, doing whatever I want. I'm saying self-reliance, where I take my responsibilities and my vocation seriously. I serve my family, I serve my church, I serve my neighborhood, but I take responsibility for that. I don't expect others to do that for me. Or is this a time to turn to the government and actually say, let them do everything for me? And there's a real movement, a universal income, taking over education, universal health care. We look to the government for everything. Well, those are two different competing worldviews of the same facts. And how about this one, a return to family control of education? We've always argued that honor your father and your mother is the ultimate. The family, the mom and dad have responsibility and authority over their children, their education, their raising. Well, we're starting to see that there's a lot of homeschooling going on right now. There's people looking to private and parochial education, all those things, and it's upsetting the public school monopoly on this. Well, who's in charge of education? Who has authority to do those things? This pandemic, some are seeing it as a way to crush homeschooling and crush parochial education. Well, we have First Amendment rights to say, no, not so fast. So how you contextualize this pandemic is key, and we're going to talk about that today. Now, there was an ad in the New York Times about this pandemic. And again, when we talked about the battle lines, we did not draw the battle lines. We're actually using First Amendment just to push back on some of these things. But there was an article in the New York Times where it talked about that reason, not prayer, was the only solution for the pandemic. And they were basically talking about prayer doesn't work, and they had WWJD on the side of the thing. And of course, prayer doesn't matter at all. Prayer doesn't accomplish anything. In fact, in this article, they said, or this ad, they said prayer fails. Well, I've been trying to explain to you, and I did it a couple weeks before, try to share with you that there is a worldview out there that doesn't just want to dialogue with us, doesn't want to compete in the realm of ideas. It would love to see the Christian worldview silenced, put in the basement, put over there to not affect what's going on in the major decisions of our culture. And so I call this, this article is, secular progressivism, a way to describe that scientism. I call it secular Puritanism, because what's the real battle for me is and I think for all of us, it's not that there's a different worldview out there. I don't have any problem engaging people's other different worldviews. But I do have a problem with the weaponization in politics, so one worldview is able to make the other one illegal and to actually start to litigate against that. And that's what we're seeing. The time that we've had in Washington already now, it's been 3 years, there are two parties, but there's one party that's aggressively becoming more secular, and then there's another party that doesn't always fight for us when the time is right to do that. And so again, we have to exercise our First Amendment rights for the sake of our church. You start asking questions like, why did Clarence Thomas and Brett Kavanaugh get treated one way? And then other politicians on the other side about the same issues get treated another way. You have the Biden issue now with the accuser. Look how he's being treated. If you don't understand what's going on there, you should read Molly Hemingway's book, Justice on Trial, where she actually goes and interviews the people that were coming after Kavanaugh. It is terrible what they did to that man. When you look at some of the things that are happening, people say, just the facts. We just want the facts. Well, the Attorney General was on Meet the Press, and I want to watch this. I want to make sure everyone's doing the job they're called to do. Well, they asked him the question about, history. How's history going to look at what you're doing? And he started off by saying, history often is written by those who are the winners. And from that point on, news was said that he was talking about it doesn't matter what the facts are, it just matters who wins. But his whole point was exactly the opposite if you watch the interview. And so my question is, why are people, they're basically taking what he said and making the exact opposite argument of what he was trying to say. So again, you start to contextualize these things and say, what's going on here? Where this really hit me is we've got an event or an issue we're dealing with. We're not deep in it yet. But there's a pastor. This isn't a Western culture. It's in Finland. There's a pastor right now who's been arrested. And the laws that he's been arrested under are it's called ethnic agitation laws. Now think about this. Ethnic agitation. So what was his crime? His crime was that 8 or 10 years ago, he wrote a pamphlet on the institution of marriage, the biblical view of the institution of marriage. And now he's being brought up on charges for having written that pamphlet. And so there's also a government official who's under siege as well. Now think about this. Ethnic agitation, homosexuality is not an ethnicity. What is he being at? What is his agitation? He's just standing up for the institution of marriage, the biblical understanding of marriage, and why it's a benefit to the culture if we put our faith and trust in that. He's not saying that other relationships can't happen. He's just trying to defend what marriage is and talking about why it's a benefit. Now think about that. Ethnic agitation. I put a different title on it. These are what I call secular blasphemy laws. You hear this thing in other countries where they have these blasphemy laws. If you disagree with some religious perspective, you can actually be arrested for that. Our First Amendment protects us away from that too, right? But now we have this thing, what I would call secular blasphemy laws, where if you don't believe in a certain way that people think, and if they have the power to do it, they will actually use that governmental, political, judicial power against your worldview. That should scare you, because that is in a Western country, a secular country, and some of that is coming our way too. So there's a movement today to use, whether it's government, media, the educational apparatus, to weaponize politics so that you can't have a dialogue. Well, we're of the mind that says, no, we want to have a dialogue. We want to be able to debate these issues, and then we want to be free to be faithful to the things that we know are true for the sake of our families, our churches, and our communities. Now, Christians, I'm just going to challenge you here. People don't like to talk about this kind of stuff, but we can't check our consciences at the door here. Do we really believe that God's moral ordering of the world is authoritative, not just for us, but for everyone? Do we believe these laws that he has put in place really are for our preservation, for the sake of our society, for the sake of our good, or not? I love how Chesterton talks about it. He says, yeah, Christianity at first sounds like it's putting all these binders on you or putting all these fences around you, until you realize when those fences are in place, then freedom runs wild. And I think that's the perspective. We want people to live free lives, to live lives in service to God, in relationship to God, and in love for their neighbors. So you got to put this all in perspective, because there are real issues out there, and we've got to engage these issues for the sake of our culture and for the sake of our church. All right, so the religious liberty issues that are out there, we're not going to go through all these because I want to get to the Supreme Court cases, especially today, but we'll just go through a few, and then we'll talk about where are you? If you're trying to open up your churches, what should you do? If a governor says, lockdown, can't have them, should you just abide by that? Should you not? What are some ways we can work forward? We've given you some principles before that you can still put to work on this, but where are we now? I do love this quote by C.S. Lewis. He said, of all the tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It would be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep, his cupidity may at sometimes be satiated, but those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. And I think that's a little bit of where we are in some of these issues today. I don't mean to make light of it, but there are people who really believe that what they're doing by creating some of the miseries that we're dealing with today, they believe they're doing something very, very good. Some of the cases that are out there, and by the way, again, Alliance Defending Freedom has been so great on these things. The Beckett Fund has been so great. The Liberty Institute has been so great on these things because they're using the litigation arm to actually help us fight these things back. But as I've said before, our role with them, and they tell me this all the time, we have really great arguments. In fact, in terms of our arguments, we can't see how we can lose. But oftentimes it's the stories, it's the heartfelt stories that are brought in, and these things make a huge difference in some of this litigation, whether we think it's right or not. And so again, how can we help? Well, if you're dealing with things, if you're dealing with issues, like we've talked about some of the Lutheran churches around the country that are under siege, and they've been trying to do everything right. They've been trying to be good citizens and practice social distancing and doing all these things, and they still are being harassed by folks. And so again, we need to bring those stories to bear on some of the work that they're doing. ADF's got a couple cases, First Baptist versus Kelly. They're suing the Kansas governor right now for the lockdown order. Why? Because they're unjustly defining the church as an entity that can be non-essential and shut down while they're opening up other entities for the sake of mass gatherings or bigger gatherings. And so they're saying you can't do that. The church has First Amendment protections, can't do that. So they're bringing that lawsuit to bear. The Metro Tabernacle versus the state of Chattanooga, or the city of Chattanooga. So again, that's another one where I thought this was an ingenious idea. Church, you come and you meet in your car, and we'll try to broadcast all of our worship to you, and we're gathered. We can see each other and look at each other, but we're not going to get out of our cars and interact with each other. Well, those were made illegal, and there's no scientific evidence. Why is that illegal? You're in this almost hermetically sealed pew, and you can pretty much be there with your family as if you're at home. Temple Baptist for the city of Greenville, same kind of thing. Drive-in churches, and these churches were harassed. They were really harassed. The police were sent by order of the governor, but you know, we're starting to see even some law enforcement say, I'm not gonna make law-abiding citizens who are good business people and good community, I'm not gonna make them criminals just because of some edict from a governor. We're starting to see even law enforcement push back on some of these things too. So that's where we're at with this. And if the First Amendment says anything, it says that we have the right to be able to petition our government and say, you don't have the right to do this, or you're not the only one who makes these decisions in and for our lives. And that's kind of where we're at with some of these things. Another religious liberty issue that's out there today that it's mind-boggling to me. It's the Little Sisters of the Poor. They're back in court. And if you remember this is one of the reasons why the LCMS got into some of these issues in D.C., is that we were being forced, our healthcare, we have our own healthcare group, Concordia Health Plans. We were being forced to honor the abortion mandate that was in the universal health care stuff of Obamacare. And we said, you can't do that. It violates our conscience. We're not going to participate in the elimination of the children among us, the most vulnerable among us. And if you remember back in those days, the government said, you're going to do it or else. Well, we pushed back. The Catholic Church really pushed back on a lot of these things. We're thankful for that, the bishops especially. But we joined that. But now you see what this kind of overreach can do. The Little Sisters, they've been in court since 2011. These are nuns who take care of the most vulnerable people in our country, and they've been shut down, or the edict was to shut them down because they wouldn't support abortion in their health care plan. That's crazy. And the government had no problem, shut them down, even though the people they served would have been served by nobody else. Well, of course, you know that the Supreme Court eventually ruled in their favor. And now, incredibly, even lower courts now are defying the Supreme Court's ruling on this. And so they're back in court trying to just say, let us serve the people we serve on our own terms. So again, this is where you start to see federal one-size-fits-all oftentimes creates all kinds of havoc when it's abusive. By the way, I hear all the time, and in my reading for this week too, running to this, the federal government was never Christian. You know, the constitutional limitation or the constitutional organization of our government is secular. Well, I can buy some of your argument there if that's the argument you're going to make, as long as you understand that what the Founding Fathers meant was that it's very limited. It's so limited that there really aren't, you know, there are no Christian compulsions to tell us whether or not you should defend your borders or that you should defend your country, because they had limited the government's role, its federal role, to very specific things. I would say, what's the religious motivation for filling a pothole? There really isn't one. I mean, fill the pothole. Do you know how to fill a pothole? Do you not know how to fill a pothole? If you limit the government's role to something very specific like that, I can buy some of your secular argument. But when you flip it upside down and have the government involved in virtually every aspect of your life, now I've got a real problem with your secular argument, because the Founding Fathers believed otherwise. They really believed that the Christian individual, the religious individual, was the key to it all. So again, some perspective on these things. Who gets to make the decision for how we go forward with this? I mean, do we just wait till the government tells us to open up our lives? And I've got three, spheres of how you can kind of think this through. There are people who take coronavirus very seriously, and we do too. As I've read more on this, it is a scarier flu than I've ever seen before in my lifetime. Whether we should be shutting all healthy people down and quarantining all healthy people, I don't know why that's the right answer. Maybe we should be protecting the most vulnerable among us. That maybe seems a lot better, because I think we can destroy our economy, which is the fuel to come up with more solutions to this in the future. There are people who are worried about the expansion of an authoritarian government. I think they definitely have a perspective here, because we're seeing government overreach all over the place as this moves forward. How can you change the dynamics? It used to be flatten the curve because it's a virus. We can't solve the virus. Viruses just kind of, over time, they can become mitigated. They can become less powerful, less potent. But there's no vaccine that's going to stop the flu. Even the flu shots you get, that's not a vaccine. It's not like polio or smallpox, where we have a vaccine. If you take this vaccine, you will not get it. Even the flu shots, and my wife and I debate all this. Should I get a flu shot? Should I not get a flu shot? Honey, I get one every year now. I mean, you're right?
Just so everyone knows, my hand is killing me.
Well, yeah, we had a little, but again, when we think about that, the flu shot it's not a vaccine. So if someone says we're not going to open up until there is absolute proof that we have something that solves this problem, then gosh, we're going to see government overreach like crazy. And then there are people very concerned about the economic devastation that is going to be happening. And so all those are legitimate concerns. And again, I say you can have kind of a balanced view of all those things. Well, when one person says, I'll make the decision for all of those things for you, we feel like they're overstating their case. So that's where we're at with a lot of these things. I suppose that at this point is to just say it this way. In our country, we don't empower one person to make all those decisions for us. We don't do that. We seek information, we seek guidance. Each person has a role to play in all of these things. But our First Amendment protections, it allows us to start to fashion our view of how to put all these things together. And so when we see the government saying, no, we have the right to educate exactly the way we want to educate, we say, no, that's my responsibility as a father or mother. And you have a right as a government to demand civics education. I agree with that. And so every parochial school, every private school, they've got to have a good civics program so that people can understand what it means to be a citizen. And that's the government's role in education. But when they start determining our moral view of life, our moral perspective of life, how we deal with the facts that are before us, As I said before, why don't we see survival of the fittest people all over the place right now? Saying, yeah, the pandemic is just doing nature's job of clearing the brush. Because we value human beings. And that's a Christian worldview. And that's a worldview that's built on the notion that God created us. So we don't empower one person to make all these decisions for us. And when one person starts to make all these decisions for us, that's tyranny. And we have First Amendment protections and right of redress. And then, of course, we have religious liberty to come up with our own solutions moving forward with the same facts and the same things before us. Secondly, the government has no right to shut the churches down. At this stage of the game, I think if you practice social distancing and some of the guidelines, we have ways of working these things out that are going to be a blessing both to our churches and to our communities. And the government doesn't have the right to determine that for all of us. They just don't. That's what the First Amendment is all about. And if they are doing that with you, and we talked about this before, talk to your pastor, talk to your church council, talk to your circuit, talk to your district, and make sure that you're thinking this through as one voice. But if you're in that position where I think it was the Illinois governor was talking about how, the churches could be closed, or de Blasio in New York saying similar things, they don't have that right. And they don't have that responsibility either. We have a responsibility to live our lives going forward. With information. So if you're having problems with that, and you're having issues with that, and you're starting to work through your circuits and your districts, honoring that there's, we need to make sure that we're speaking with one voice on these things as best we can, then let me know about that. Because that's where Alliance Defending Freedom and Liberty Institute and the Becket Fund are saying that's how you can be of service to how we do our work too. Religious liberty. COVID-19, it looks like going forward there are going to be some challenges. So we need to be prepared for that. I want to step aside a little bit and maybe go a little different direction because there's a lot of stuff going on, and I just want you to be aware of this for your sake, and this is especially for the sake of the mission and ministry of the church. There are three big cases right now before the Supreme Court, and they're going to have a huge effect on how we can do ministry going forward. And it's the Holmes versus the EEOC case, and that's the funeral home case. It's the June Medical Services case versus Russo, and that's about abortion clinics having to have a relationship with the hospitals in case something goes wrong, and they can actually bring their patient to the hospital for care. And then the one that's probably most important, well, they're all important, but the one that's even got a bigger reach into how our church will do its ministry, two Catholic schools are being sued because they fired two teachers. And again, if you remember, Lutherans, the Supreme Court case that has defined this kind of stuff is a Lutheran case, Hosanna Tabor. It was a Supreme Court case where Hosanna Tabor, the Supreme Court ruled, I think it was 9-0, that they had the right to let a teacher go because they have the right to determine who teaches in their schools, and they have the right to determine what they teach, especially about the things of faith. And that's what's going on in these Catholic schools, and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has said the Hosanna Tabor case has nothing to do with this. Well, they're absolutely wrong on that. But that's where this litigation is going. That could actually start to eat away at some of those protections that have been given to the church through the Hosanna Tabor case. We'll talk about that in a minute. But all of these court cases are testing the boundaries as to what government agencies and non-elected groups within government can do to establish law without legislation. So, if, for instance, one of these cases involves the civil rights case of 1964. And in that case, the word sex meant male and female. It's a binary thing. You're either XX or you're XY. This whole construct of sexual orientation, which is heaped onto sex, is not what was covered in 1964. So if you want to cover that, our view is then you have to legislate that. What you can't do is have some unelected agency start redefining the word in that legislation. Original intent meant, sex meant male, female. Now we see people saying, well, we don't think it means that. Well, then legislate it. Don't ask the court to just say it doesn't matter. You do whatever you feel like doing. And that's what the EEOC is doing. in this one case. We'll get to that in a minute. All three involve federal employment and non-discrimination laws according to Title VII. So Title VII is going to be one of these things where it's going to test the boundaries of religious liberty. And if we lose these cases, there's other things, other ramifications to losing these cases, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then all three of them, there's a secular Puritanism that is moving into our culture, and they're using the courts to define this. Because if they can say religious liberty is only for your personal and private use, if they can only say the only one that has religious liberty is a pastor, not the church, not Christians who happen to own businesses, then you're going to start to see litigation like you've never seen before. And it's really meant to shut the church's voice, its moral voice. Listen, I don't want to ever legislate that you have to believe in Jesus. Faith is something that comes by hearing, and hearing by the grace of God in the Word of God. Okay, and there's no compulsion to that. We invite you to receive the gift of grace in Jesus Christ. But the moral teachings of the Bible are fundamental to other religions, other societies even. We've seen, because it's written on the conscience of every human being. And we have the right to argue for those moral principles as those things that actually civilize us and make us humane. When you can let a baby die in a hospital room when they're born alive in the 9th month just because they weren't supposed to live, you are not humane. You are not acting in a human way. We look at the Nazis for what they did to human beings, and we're disgusted. And yet we're not disgusted by that. So these moral principles are meant to prevent us from being the worst that we all could be if we had no compulsion from a higher authority and a moral structure to the world to keep us from being that way. So again, we'll talk about those things in just a second. Again, the concern that I have, that I want to make sure you understand, the concern I have is not that there are people who disagree with us. I love debating with people and talking to people who have radically different views than I do. And I want to see, well, why do you believe that? And why do you think that? And if you believe that, what about this? This is about a group of people that is weaponizing politics and using it to stifle that debate. If you don't believe me, try having some of these debates in college classes around the country. Try having these debates in forums where we're supposed to be debating ideas. You will see how fast those things get shut down. It always cracks me up when people say we should have, I often hear people, we should hear both sides. And yet I go, well, most of our cities are run by one worldview now. There's no debate going on. There's a lot of places where the debate has been stifled, and we're seeing all kinds of problems that are coming, and there's no debate about solutions and different solutions. So I love the idea of debate, and I love the idea of that. What I'm worried about is the force of law being used to silence debate. By the way, that, the Obergefell ruling, which for those of you who know what I'm talking about, that's the ruling about homosexual marriage. And first of all, we just think it's a bad constitutional ruling. There is no constitutional protection, even for marriage, for a male and female, because the Constitution is your individual rights before the law. In fact, again, our argument about marriage is the government has to answer, why can they force someone to give up their rights and sign a contract called marriage? Why should a man and a woman be forced to do that? And the government's answer is because we don't want to raise your kids. That's their nefarious involvement in marriage. They're not granting the right of marriage to a man and a woman. They're limiting their rights and calling it marriage for that reason. So again, when we get involved in this, I remember talking this through with people, and I was told this is just about honoring, the loving relationship of other people, and it's only going to be narrowly ruled on. It's only going to have to do with the right of people who have a different understanding of marriage to have that marriage. Well, if that's the case, and I was told over and over that is very narrow, then why are clinics right now, pro-life clinics, being harassed because they don't believe in that view of marriage? Why are adoption agencies around the country being shut down, and the kids that they're serving being actually put back in the system with no real care for those kids because they were being cared for because the system was already overloaded? Why are they being shut down because they have a different view of the institution of marriage? Why is that happening? If it was only supposed to be this narrow thing. And why are businesses being harassed who have a different view of this? When they can go and get whatever they want, they can get a cake, they can go wherever, at any other place. I call it they have access. If there was no other access to these services, that'd be one thing. But when you can go right down the street and get the exact same service, why does every deli need to be kosher? We wrote a mom and pop paper on that. They don't. That's the whole point. If there's access to all these different places, then why are these businesses being sued into oblivion? And that's really the issue with some of this, the weaponization of politics, creating stuff by fiat that stifles a worldview that happens to disagree with your worldview. The first one was the June medical services. Everyone says it's, abortion is always about women's health, right? Well, in Louisiana, they said, okay, you're right. So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that abortion clinics have to have admitting services to nearby hospitals in case something goes wrong in the abortion procedure. And there's all kinds of things that can go wrong in abortion procedures, both physiological and emotional. And the question is, you should be able to take a woman immediately for the sake of her life for that. Well, again, who's fighting back on that? The abortion industry is fighting back. They're saying this is a limitation, placing these requirements as an undue burden on our constitutional right to an abortion. There it goes again. The misuse of the judicial system to create a right out of thin cloth that now is protecting them from doing something that really is for the sake of the women who are even going through those procedures. It really is just cutting into their profits, truth be told. But again, that's what that is about. And so when you start to see these arguments, you start to see that women's health is not really the issue, and the abortion industry is a billion-dollar industry, and it should, again, just give us pause. We're actually making money off kids. When George Bush said he didn't want to expand the use of stem cells, I'll never forget this. It was one of the best arguments ever. He said, I know that stem cells, once they're used, you can use them forever, so I'm going to stop it there because there's unlimited use of what's there. But I'm going to stop any more harvesting of stem cells from babies because I don't want to incentivize and make a business out of killing kids. That is a great argument. And Larry King couldn't understand it. He said, well, are you against it or are you for it? And I thought that was one of the best arguments you could make. But when you think about these things, that's what that case is about. The second case is about Our Lady of Guadalupe School and St. James Catholic School. And again, in this situation, they let go of two teachers. And again, these teachers sued. And now the question is, do they have the right to sue, and what's the reason? And again, the church has always been exempt from government interference in how we deal with our own, because the church has a very specific worldview, and their schools they also teach a worldview around the things that they talk about. And if someone doesn't believe in those things, the church has a right to exercise their authority to say we want our schools to be taught and to teach the way we wish them to be taught. It's really interesting because, a good teacher makes a huge difference in your life. A really good teacher can make a huge difference in your life. And I remember I got into something like this when I was a young pastor, that we had a teacher in our school. She was a great gal. I really liked her a lot. Somehow she had gotten to the point where she was teaching our religion classes, and she wasn't a member of our church. And I was like, wow, I thought at least religion classes, they should be taught by our church people, and maybe even our pastors, right? Because that's our role. Well, she wasn't, and I'm not going to get into how that all happened. There's all kinds of reasons why things happen. But I finally asked her, I said, okay, well, let's talk about, I knew that this was a job that she wanted, and she was a good person, and I enjoyed her at our church, at our school. But I said, here's what I need you to teach in this class, though. And there were a couple of fundamental teachings to our church. She said, well, I don't believe that. I said, well, but you have to teach this. I believe it, and I can demonstrate why it's true, but if you don't believe it, that's your right. And I said, so you need to teach this. And she said, no. I'll never forget that. She looked me in the eye, she said, no. And I said, well, then you can't be a teacher here. And see, we have that, not just right, we have that responsibility to our children, okay? And so again, that's kind of what this case is all about. And the real question is, who gets to teach our children, and what's the role of their education of our children? And as I've said before, I think the government has it has a vested interest in education. They want good civics taught in education. And I would challenge you to say, is civics being taught well in our educational system? But that's a whole other discussion. But they have a role there. They have a right to that. Hey, that has to be done even if you're a parochial school or a private school. I would suggest that even homeschools are probably doing a better job of doing some of these things. Parochial schools are doing a better job of teaching citizenship in their schools. The government does not have the right to start defining the moral context of all these issues. And that's where we're at in some of these issues today. And that's what this case is all about. So, 2 plus 2 may equal 4, but the question is, what does math actually mean for our lives? Like I said before, we talked about this, I think a couple times before, there's a scientistic notion out there that science solves all our problems. Science gives us data. The data still has to be put in the context, a moral context, to make sure that that data is being used properly. So teachers do make all the difference. And again, we want to make sure that in this particular case, that there's a healthy understanding of the unique roles of the church and the state going forward. So the Constitution requires that the teacher employment stuff be left to the churches, their way of structuring, their oversight, their church councils, their religious bodies, those kinds of things. And there's ways of redressing these issues through those as well. Okay, so it's not just that the church can do as they please sometimes. But again, the government has maintained a healthy distance on these things. And we think they need to do that here too. So we don't have to sacrifice our mission, our belief, because we are part of educating our own people for the sake of education and the culture. And then finally, the other issue that's out there is the Harris-Holmes issue, and that's where there's a person, and I guess he passed away. I didn't realize that he was sick, but he was a person who had been working for this funeral home for many, many, many years. He was a man who one day came in dressed as a woman and wanted to be transgender in service to the people that they were caring for at this funeral home. And the owners of the funeral home, happened to be Christian, was saying, no, at this point in people's suffering, this is not the issue they need to be confronted with, and we have these standards and we can't abide by this. And so he was suing for his right to maintain his employment, even though he didn't meet the standards that they had for that employment. And that case is now before the Supreme Court. That's going to have huge ramifications on Christian businesses going forward. So in all these things, what's going on here is these cases are about life. These cases are about religious liberty. These cases are about the future of freedoms, our religious liberty freedoms, and our moral freedoms, if you will, to be free to be faithful, free to serve the way God wants us to serve. And let me just close by saying this. This is about electing judges. This is what it's all about. The caricature that's out there is that there's conservative judges and liberal judges. That's wrong. That's a caricature. There are secular progressive judges who believe that judicial system should legislate if they feel the legislators haven't done their job. That is a misunderstanding and a misuse of the judicial system. The people that we want to put in those places are people who honor the laws as they are written. Original intent for the Constitution. And we may not always win the case even with original intent people, but we want the original intent people to say this is what the Constitution says, what it doesn't say, and if you want to amend it, there's a different process. If you want to legislate a law, there's a process to do that, and it doesn't happen with people on the bench. The last thing you want in a lot of these issues, and I can go back to Dred Scott and its bad ruling that ripped us apart as a nation, and go back to Roe v. Wade. In fact, both people that were involved in Roe v. Wade are pro-life people now. They were misused to actually make the case. And even Obergefell. This is when judicial people in black robes say, well, they haven't decided this legislatively, so let's just make a decision. That's not the way it's supposed to be done. And then we have a federal system where the states actually start legislating differently. And in a lot of these issues, New York's going to be different than a Missouri. Missouri is going to be different than a Florida and Texas, California. And that's healthy too, because it keeps the dialogue alive. So in all these things, we support dialogue. We support engaging one another, even when we disagree with one another. In fact, Jesus even tells us to love our enemies. So we're not about shutting down the conversation. We are about pushing back on those who want to weaponize politics, and they want to use it to actually shut down that voice. So again, these things matter, and that's the kind of things that you should be thinking about as you exercise your citizenship going forward. So thanks for watching. Thanks for being a part of Liberty Live. Sorry we had to do a kind of a flip upside down. I want to thank my lovely wife who has been holding the camera this time. I usually have it all set up. Her arm is killing her right now. She's saying, please close it off. But again, I want you to understand your role. You have a responsibility in this country to exercise your temporal liberties for the sake of the moral teachings of the Scripture, for the sake of the culture. We have a role in the civilizing and the humanizing and the humaneness of the very culture in which we live. And God preserves our culture through that engagement. And America gives us Caesar responsibilities. That's what's amazing. Caesar responsibilities to do that. We want to exercise those temporal liberties, yes, for the sake of the culture, but also for the sake of proclaiming the good news of Jesus Christ. So put your temporal liberties to work for the sake of the eternal liberties of Christ, and we will see you next time. By the way, again, go to our lcrlfreedom.org website. Go to our lcrlfreedom.org website. There's all kinds of other information there for you. And we're just glad that you're coming along with us because we're all in this together, and God has plenty of work for us to do. God bless you. Have a great week. See you next time.